Okay, we're ready for our next speaker. We have Ms. Celeste Padilla. She's a grant manager in the Division of Grants Administration. She's been with us for 10 months, and we're just can't believe how happy we are to have her with us because she has turned us, helped us out so much with our Perkins funding. She comes with 15 years experience in working with grants at the post-secondary and secondary level. And she has learned a lot about Perkins, and she teaches us something every day that we didn't know about. And we're just happy to have her here to help you out, and help me welcome Celeste Padilla.
I know. That was great. I wish it was all true. Good morning. I am happy to be here. I am a grant manager at TEA. I am fairly new. I've been there about 10 months, and I'm learning that with the grant cycle at TEA, it's going to take me a good year, year and a half before I feel pretty comfortable and pretty knowledgeable. So when it comes time for questions, keep your expectations low, and Diane and her team will help me answer those. So what we're going to do today, and I said this earlier, the information that I'm sharing is not riveting. It's not riveting, but it's important. And I think that it's important for you to know about it. So we're going to be talking about Perkins funding, federal Perkins funding, the eligibility, the allocations, shared services arrangements, use of funds, the application process using eGrants, budgeting, and some helpful resources, and then some Q&A. And as I understand it, I'm speaking to people who are relatively new in this role. Is that correct? Okay, no counselors, right? Okay. Because I was talking to counselors, all right. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's start at the very beginning, which is, where does the money come from? So the money that we're talking about this morning is federal Perkins dollars, and that comes from the U.S. Department of Education. The funding that we get is split between TEA and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. 70% stays at TEA for secondary education, and 30% goes to the coordinating board for post-secondary education. So they in turn make grants to community and technical colleges. So what we're going to be talking about today is that 70%. We get that 70%, and we in turn put that money into essentially 3 buckets of funding. If you can imagine these 3 buckets. The first and largest bucket is the 85% that flows to LEAs in the form of formula-funded grants. 10% stays at TEA and is used for leadership projects, like funding things like this. Funds different websites that you guys use, funds academies, special projects, evaluation of CTE. That's what that 10% goes to. And then 5% is used for state-level administration. So the part that we're talking about, we're drilling down, the part that we're talking about even further is that large bucket, the 85%. Now I want to briefly just show you a comparison about the Perkins dollars you get, the federal Perkins dollars, versus the state dollars that you get to help fund your CTE programs. That first bullet is what we get, the 85% that we get from USDE, that $55 million. That's what goes back to LEAs across the state. That second bullet, that's from State Foundation School Program. That's your state CTE dollars. So you can see that even the largest dollar of federal Perkins funding is very small compared to your state dollars. And I don't want to confuse you because you guys have access to local CTE funds, state CTE funds, and these federal Perkins dollars. And we're talking about the federal Perkins dollars. So how does one become eligible for Perkins dollars? Well, we have to award funds to CTE programs of sufficient size, scope, and quality. And Texas defines size, scope, and quality in terms of enrollment in coherent sequences as reported in PEIMS. So that reporting, that PEIMS reporting is very, very, very important. If your district either fails to report coherent sequences or reports it incorrectly, that can affect your eligibility. So you do want to make sure that whether it's you or your PEIMS person or the people at the ESC, that you're getting the help that you need to make sure you're inputting information in PEIMS accurately. So size, scope, and quality, just a tad more on this. Scope and quality is defined by evidence of a coherent sequence of CTE courses. That's a very, very important aspect of the eligibility. And size is determined by coherent sequence enrollment. So for LEAs, we're saying to be eligible, you have to have at least 10 students enrolled in coherent sequences. It's a little bit different for charter schools. Do we have any charter schools here? Okay. So for charter schools, it's a minimum of 5. Again, goes back to the PEIMS. We look at PEIMS prior year fall snapshot data. And we look at Code 2 students. So LEAs that don't enroll students in coherent sequences are not eligible for federal Perkins dollars. And I don't want to get too much into this because it's more of a programmatic aspect, but it's really important. We want to see that you actually have these coherent sequences. That is an indication of a more robust, comprehensive CTE program. So that was eligibility. And your eligibility has nothing to do with your allocation, which is the amount of funding. Okay, you can have 200 students enrolled in coherent sequences, and that has nothing to do with your grant amount. And I want to make sure that's really clear, because I think sometimes there's a perception that the larger your program, the more money you're going to get. And that is not the case with these federal dollars. Your allocation is based on a calculation of Census Bureau data. We look at population and poverty counts of individuals ages 5 through 17. If any of you are working also with NCLB, we use the same data to do this formula as we do NCLB funding. This information gets adjusted annually by Census Bureau information. Population and poverty counts for charter schools are based on the SC 50/50. Those of you in charter schools know a little bit about this. And again, there's that reminder, CTE student counts and coherent sequence counts are not used to calculate any portion of your allocation. So back to the formula. 90% of your grant amount, 90% of your allocation is based on that Census Bureau data. 70% of that 90 is actually based on poverty counts of individuals ages 5 to 17. And that means, somebody asked yesterday, how can I increase my allocation? Generally speaking, there's very, very, very little that you can do to increase your allocation because you can't change the population and poverty counts in your district. So 70% is based on poverty, which means if your poverty counts in your district, if poverty goes down, which we would all agree is a good thing, that could impact your allocation. You would get less funding. And then 30% of that 90 is population counts. Okay, so population and poverty based on Census Bureau. That's your allocation. There's 10% remaining, and that 10% is the 10% that you might be able to have an impact on your allocation. We call that 10% incentive funding. Did I skip that? So that 10% is based on your performance measures. And when you get your grant award, you'll get your formula allocation, and there's a line that says incentive funding. If you've met 4 out of the 5 performance measures, then right now you're eligible for a small incentive award. I will say this, that right now there's some conversations happening at the agency about changing the way incentive funding is awarded. Because truthfully, almost every LEA gets some incentive funding right now. I'd say, and I'm making this up, I'd say about 90%, 85 or 90% of LEAs get incentive funding. And the very name really implies it's supposed to be an incentive, it's supposed to reward districts that are doing a really great job with CTE. And so we're looking at, should we, or is this too easy? Is the bar too low? And do we need to be taking a step back and really making sure that those funds are going to districts that are truly doing a really good job with their CTE program? So just be aware that that's a conversation that's taking place. That was eligibility and allocation. How many of you are part of a shared services arrangement? Okay, just a few. How many of you serve as a fiscal agent for a shared services arrangement? Okay, so some of you might be asking, what is a shared services arrangement? So an SSA is a partnership of 2 or more LEAs that apply for funding through a fiscal agent. So oftentimes, a bunch of districts will get together and they'll work with their ESC, and the ESC will serve as a fiscal agent. Or if there's a cluster of very small districts, those will get together and apply as an SSA. There's a congressional intent when SSAs were created, and that is that LEAs with small allocations can leverage their funding and leverage their outcomes by joining an SSA. And the purpose was to achieve a mutually beneficial purpose, which I'll come back to in a minute. So any district, regardless of how large your grant award is, any district can join an SSA. In some cases, TEA requires you to join an SSA, and that is if you are a very, very small district and your allocation is less than $15,000, or you have a very, very small coherent sequence, less than 10 students. In that case, we say it really isn't financially viable for you to manage your own grant. We want you to be a part of an SSA because it's going to end up being better for all members. There are exceptions, but we won't get into that right now. So if you are a member of an SSA or you are a fiscal agent, you're part of a partnership. You're basically have an agreement with each other, and there should always be a written agreement in place that basically says, what does each partner agree to do? Because the fiscal agent is relying on the members to do certain things, and the members are relying on the fiscal agent to do certain things. And you want to know what those certain things are, and the best way to know that is to make sure it's all written down in an agreement. So I mentioned the mutually beneficial aspect. That's an important part of an SSA. And basically, any funds that get budgeted, and this will probably only mean anything to the fiscal agents and the SSA, so I'll go quickly. Any funds that are budgeted in 6493 on your eGrants application must be used for purposes that benefit more than one member of that SSA. The action of just flowing funds through and back to the LEA, that doesn't meet that criteria. So here's a couple examples. Where's the fiscal agents in the room? Over here, right? Transferring funds to every LEA in the SSA to purchase supplies and materials, that doesn't meet the criteria of mutually beneficial. But if an SSA member uses funds received through 6493 to operate a CTE training academy that serves all members, that's clearly mutually beneficial. Likewise, if an LEA receiving funds employs a career counselor that serves all members, that's mutually beneficial. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's talk about the required uses of Perkins funds. And much of this might be a review. I don't know. If it is, I will go through. Is this a review, or do you guys already know this? New information, review? Okay. New. All right. Is it really new? Okay. So, required uses of funds with your Perkins dollars. Integrating academic and CTE courses. Linking CTE to post-secondary education. Expanding the use of technology in your CTE program. Providing students with experience in training. Providing professional development to CTE staff, including counselors. Developing and implementing evaluations of your CTE program. Ensuring programs, courses, and technology are modern and relevant. Providing services and activities of sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. And lastly, providing activities to prepare special populations for high-skill, high-wage jobs. Now, if you don't already know that and you don't remember those 9 resources, there's a resource that I want to point out to you guys. Every grant that TEA administers, whether it's a federal grant, a state grant, $1 million, $1,000, every grant that we release from the agency has program guidelines that go along with the grant. And it clearly, those guidelines, it's like the Bible for each grant, all the information you need to know. And so most of what I'm covering from here on out is in those program guidelines. And at the end of the presentation, there's a link. But I have this book, and I keep it right next to my computer. When you call me and ask questions, or when Diane's team calls me and asks questions, I go to my book. Because I'll tell you, everything in here came from TEA's website. And I will say 2 things about TEA's website. One, it's very, very, very difficult to find information. But 2, the information is really, really, really good. There is information on everything. And I would really, if you're new, I would very much encourage you to take an hour out of your day and go through and peruse the website, particularly go to the administering a grant section. There are so many helpful manuals, and so when you call and ask me a question, I might know the answer, but if I don't, I go to one of my handouts, one of my manuals that I've printed out, and I go to all the time, and I find my answer. And so you don't have to memorize this information, you don't have to know it all, you need to know where to go and get it. And so once you find a good resource that you think is going to be really helpful, either print it out or bookmark it, because you may not be able to find it again. And so become very familiar with those resources. And those 9 required uses are right on the program guidelines. So I wanted to bring that up, and I'm going to refer to this again in a couple of different instances. Now, these 9 required uses, you can meet these 9 requirements through either your local or your state or your federal Perkins dollars. So here's an example of some allowable uses of funds. And I'm going to point out that those program guidelines I mentioned, there is a long, long list of allowable uses of funds and a long list of unallowable. Likewise, there's a really long list of examples of what you can and can't do. And that is not all inclusive. You have to ask yourself, is what you're wanting to do with the funds, does it meet those 9 required uses? That's one of the first questions you should ask. So, a couple of examples of allowable uses of funds. Providing career guidance and academic counseling. Providing support for local education and business partners. Yes, we want that. Improving or developing CTE courses. providing programs for special populations that you serve, developing initiatives to facilitate that transition from secondary to post-secondary education, providing teacher prep programs that address the integration of academic and CTE courses. Yes, those are all allowable. A couple of the unallowable: cost of membership in a civic organization, hosting or sponsoring a conference, construction or remodeling of facilities, salaries and bonuses for classroom CTE teachers, academic remediation for your CTE students, furniture purchases, unless it is industry specific, like a dental chair, motorized vehicles. Now, I want to just say that even though there might be a long list of unallowable uses of funds with your federal Perkins dollars, just because it's unallowable with federal dollars doesn't mean it's unallowable with your local and state. And I say that because you need to become pretty familiar with what you can and can't do with each of those sources of funding. If you can't do it with federal, doesn't mean you can't do it with state. So you want to know that so you can be really wise in how you're using those funds. Does that make sense? Okay, so I have a pop quiz. Perkins funding can be used to purchase new state-of-the-art equipment to meet industry specifications. Yes, it's easy. To pay a stipend for a CTE student internship. No, can't. For consumable supplies. No. To develop curriculum materials for CTE. To take CTE students on a field trip to a culinary institution. It's a trick question. It's actually yes. Yes, however, you have to have prior approval. So when you send in your Perkins grant application, you need to tell us that you want to go on this field trip. There's a form required, and as long as we can see that there is a logical, like this makes perfect sense, that you would take some of your CTE students to this field trip. And as long as you have prior approval, you can do that. To pay salaries of counseling personnel or your special POPs coordinator. Yes, you can pay salaries for these folks. You cannot pay salaries for a CTE teacher. There's a difference. To pay membership fees and a CTSO for an individual student. No, that individual student is the key there. If you wanted to do that for the whole group of students, yes, you could. To enhance connections with post-secondary institutions. Absolutely, we want you to do that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about receipt of goods and services. So your Perkins grants for 2016-2017 just started. And those grants all end on August 15th, 2017. This doesn't really matter to you, but it's just recently that we changed that date of the end date. I think last year was the first year, am I right? And we did that for a reason, because basically we say that August 15th, 2017 is the end of the academic year. So we know that your schools probably close in May, but we're saying that the academic year in Texas goes through August 15th, 2017. And we're doing that really to give you some flexibility. So in the summer, if there is some professional development, some conferences that you want to go to that is going to make you better at your job and make your CTE program stronger, that's okay, that's allowable. Because we say here on this slide, goods and services delivered near the end of the grant period may be viewed as not necessary. So you do have to be a little, be cautious about making huge expenditures at the end of the grant. If you're suddenly, spending $30,000 at the beginning of August, it might look to TEA auditors as stockpiling. So be diligent and be logical and be thoughtful about how you're using that money. And we do want to give you flexibility to use those Perkins dollars over the summer months. So, like I just said, TEA monitors or auditors, they may ask questions, and that's okay. That's what they're supposed to do. As long as you have documentation that shows the need for your expenditures, as long as you can demonstrate how it was beneficial, and negate that stockpiling. You don't want to do that. What is a reasonable cost? Well, generally speaking, a reasonable cost is ordinary and necessary for the operation of your program. We want to see evidence that you're acting with responsibility and prudence. You know, these are federal dollars, so you need to show some responsibility in how you're using them, and show that there are no significant deviations from established practices at your LEA that unjustifiably increase the grant costs. Okay? It is kind of common sense, and if you ever have a question about what you can and can't do in expenditures, you can call me, you can talk to your CTE staff. Does everybody here know what I'm talking about when I say supplement, not supplant? Okay, who doesn't? Okay, who is not listening whatsoever? Okay, good, you're still here. Okay, good. Hey, I told you it wasn't riveting. I know it's not riveting, but it's important, so I appreciate your attention. So with federal dollars, with all federal dollars, supplement, not supplant, comes into play. So what this means is that your federal Perkins dollars have to be used to supplement, increase the level of service, not supplant, meaning replace funds from non-federal sources. So any program activity that is required by state law, state board of education, your local board policy, cannot be paid for with Perkins federal dollars. And you and your district have to maintain documentation that clearly demonstrates the supplementary nature of Perkins funds. And supplement, not supplant, can get really tricky. So the test for trying to determine whether or not you are supplementing or supplanting is just to ask yourself, if I didn't have these federal funds, would I still be able to conduct this program or provide this service with other funds? And if you answer yes to that question, then you might be supplanting, and you need to take a good look at what you're doing. You have to demonstrate that if you didn't have these federal dollars, you wouldn't be able to conduct the activity. Now, I mentioned resources, and this is one of the resources that I really recommend checking out further. There is, at the last page of my presentation, there's a link to Supplement, Not Supplant Handbook on TEA's website. It's really good because it goes into a lot of detail, and it offers a whole bunch of different scenarios and gets you to think, is this supplanting or supplementing? When you're talking about salaries, that can get really confusing, so I very much encourage you to check out that Supplement, Not Supplant Handbook on TEA's website. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the application process. How many of you here in this room are the people who actually worked on your Perkins application in eGrants? Okay, that's good. Most of TEA's formula grants, in fact all of them, we do it through eGrants. So you're able just to log on, enter all your information in eGrants, and hit submit. And for those of you who either haven't done this yet or might never, it's still good to know what the process is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about getting access to eGrants, the different roles in eGrants, the negotiation process once you submit your application, the reallocation process that's coming up in a couple, actually like in a month, and then amendments. So in order to access eGrants, you have to have a TEAS account. And this slide is basically, and you can when you're back at your office in front of your computer, you can go through it and get your own TEAS account. And basically you're saying you're going to request an access form. You get your TEAS log on. There's a whole set of TEAS frequently asked questions. If you want to change your access level in TEAS, you go to the Add Modify application. And let me tell you why this is necessary. Right here are different roles that you can have at your district in eGrants. Sometimes we get a phone call saying, I'm doing the application, I entered everything, but it's not letting me submit. I keep hitting the button and it's not letting me submit. Well, that's an easy one, because if the button isn't actually letting you do anything, it's not active, that means that whoever's calling me doesn't have the right role. So all these different roles have a different level of access and function. So if you have a grant writer, some large districts pay a grant writer, pay a consultant, which is totally not necessary, by the way, in my opinion. Super easy to do this. Really, if you're doing that, you should stop. If you're a grant writer, you don't have the function to submit it. It's usually like a superintendent. So you need to figure out what is it that you want to do and make sure you have the right access. And if you feel like you're a grant writer, but you want to be able to change and edit and save and submit, then click on the role descriptions, see what all those roles are, and then you would go back to this Add Modify, and that allows you to change the role. And it does have to be approved, because you can't make the decision. If you're a grant writer right now, you can't suddenly decide that you want to be the one to submit. You have to go through your superintendent. So it takes a couple of days to make that change. So as you're getting ready for your academic year, or as you're getting ready for next year's application, start early and make sure you have the right access. And like I said, this will show you what all the roles really mean. And I think it takes you to this, and it just gives you an example of what grant manager, I think it's grantee manager, grant writer, what all those roles really are. So you submit your grant to us. And of course, like I said, this just happened. The deadline for 2016-2017 applications was August 31st. And all those grants come to my department, Grants Administration. And what happens is, and some of you might know this firsthand, we get your application and we open it up in eGrants, and we have negotiation. We have negotiators who work different regions, and they read every part of your grant. They read your narrative, they read your budget, and if they have questions, or let's say you want to go on a field trip, but you didn't attach the right forms, or let's say you want to do out-of-state travel, but you didn't have your out-of-state travel form, or you're buying a piece of equipment and you're using a brand name, which you're not allowed to do. We have to say back, we email you in the actual application. We put a message in your application, and it comes to you in an email. And we basically say, hey, could you please go in and add more information to your narrative? What are you doing to make sure your special populations are getting the services they need? What are you doing to make sure non-traditional is getting their services? You forgot your out-of-state travel form. Whatever it is, you'll get an email. They'll tell you to go to your application. You fix it, and you resubmit it. It's a very simple process, and if any of you have been through that negotiation process, hopefully you know that our negotiators are really, really helpful, and they want to make it easy for you. So once your application is all okay, it goes through a final compliance review, then it goes through just a couple more levels before finally somebody hits the button saying it's all good to go. When that happens, you will get a NOGA, a Notice of Grant Award. And that notice of grant award is basically your sign that you're good to go and you're ready to expend funds. The information on your NOGA is part of your grant agreement. I want to step back for 1 second. Whoever certifies and submits, whoever pushes that button, whether it's you or your superintendent, it's really important. You know, with great power comes great responsibility. Whoever pushes that button is basically saying, I am aware of everything in the program guidelines. I am aware of the fiscal policies. I am aware of it, and we're adhering to it. So it is kind of good that you know what you're saying you're adhering to. So every NOGA also comes with a NOGA transmittal letter that contains additional information about amendments, reporting expenditures, that information. So we give you a lot of information, and it can be really overwhelming at times, but like I said, you don't always have to remember everything. Just be aware of it and know where to go when you have to access that part of your brain. Reallocations. So some federal programs have what's called carryover. You're familiar with the carryover. If you didn't use your $15, $16, you left money there, some programs allow you to carry it over to $16, $17. That is not the case with Perkins. There is no carryover. So that means that it's really prudent for you to use all of your federal dollars. When we see that districts are not using all of your federal grant funds, it raises questions. And we think to ourselves, what are they doing? Or what are they not doing? And why are we giving them this money if they're not using it effectively? And as a state, TEA, we very, very, very rarely give back any federal dollars. We bend over backwards to make sure we do not lapse any funding. It's a big, big deal in our department. Because if the feds see that we keep returning funding, they're going to cut it. And we don't want that to happen. And so my advice is to always make sure you know what your expenditures are, how much you have left, and make sure you're using it effectively. Because you can't carry it over. What we do allow is reallocation. So I described at the beginning this whole formula that we use to give you your initial allocation. So by around the end of November, beginning of December every year, we say, okay, it's time to do reallocation, and we look at all the LEAs who got Perkins funding in 15-16, and we basically recapture that. We say, okay, we're taking it all from all of you guys, we're putting it back into a pot, and we're running the formula again, and we're reallocating that. So what that means is that if you are if you've been really good stewards of your funds, you've been great grant managers, and you've been using your money, and you have $0 left, in a way, you kind of get rewarded because you'll get some reallocation dollars. If you are one of the districts who had $20,000 left unused, you'll get some back, but it won't be anywhere close to $20,000. That's going to the districts who are actually using the money. So around late November, early December, when there's less activity at your guys' districts, what we do is we lock you out of eGrants for like a 2-3 week period. We lock you out, and our negotiators go into your grants and put in your money. And we put it in to wherever you had the most funds budgeted, the largest class object code. Because chances are, if that was your largest pot of money, that's where you're going to use the funds. So we lock you out, we go in, we put all your money in, and then we open it back up. And we'll give you a heads up. You'll get a listserv message from Grants Administration, you'll probably get one from CTE staff, and you'll also know how much you're going to get. We'll tell you all of that before we do it. We lock you out, we do it, and then we open it back up. Then you'll go in and see, oh, okay, they put it in, I don't know, supplies and materials. And if you don't like where we put it, then in that case, you can do an amendment. It's actually much, much easier for you guys, for us to do it that way. Okay, does that make sense? So that's going to be happening right around the corner. Amendments. How and when to do an amendment. Now, we have tried to make some changes here. We have tried to make it less cumbersome for you guys to make changes. And so there are many, many, many instances when you want to make a change to your grant that you do not need to do an amendment. And it's actually, when you do an amendment, when you don't need to, it puts a burden on us as well. So again, in my Bible, I have a handout. There's a PDF on the Grants Administration website called When to Amend. And it's a whole chart that says, okay, if you're doing this with federal dollars, do you need to do an amendment or don't you? If you're doing this, do you need to do an amendment? So it's really, really handy. I refer to that quite often, and I would encourage you guys to become familiar with it. So a couple of cases when amendments are required is when you are adding a class object code that was not previously budgeted. If you're increasing or decreasing the amount of funds in a class object code by more than 25% of your total grant, I have that in bold, of your total grant. If you're adding a position that was not initially approved, or if you're adding a new line item on any supporting budget schedule. These are just a couple of examples of when an amendment would be needed. When it's not required, if you're increasing or decreasing the number of positions approved by 20% or less, if you're increasing the salary amount of funds budgeted for a position by less than 10%, if you're increasing or decreasing the amount of funds in a class object code by 25% of less of total budget. There's a lot of cases where you do not need to do an amendment. So we have another pop quiz. So an amendment is needed to increase salary amounts of funds budgeted by 10% or less. No. Nope. If it was over 10%, then yes, you would. But it's less than, so no. Add a position not initially approved. Yes. And you can kind of see, I mean, use, some critical thinking skills, and you can kind of determine what is and isn't. Revise the scope or objective of the grant. You're revising the scope, your whole objective. Yes, that's a big thing. And to be honest, this is kind of a trick question too, I guess, because it'd be really hard for you to change the scope of your grant, because your whole purpose is Perkins and CTE. It would be very, very difficult for you to change that scope. Increase the quantity of computer hardware previously approved. You don't have to, because it was previously approved and you're saying instead of 7, we're going to get 10. And of course, if purchasing 3 more made that increase by more than 25% of your total grant, then it would. But it's probably not going to do that. So no. To add out-of-state travel. You didn't have out-of-state travel in your original grant. Now you realize you want to go to a conference in DC. Do you need to do an amendment? Yes, you do. Out-of-state travel has to have prior approval, has to have an additional form, so it does require an amendment. Another handbook that I want to point you to that I think will be probably especially useful to this group is the Budgeting Costs Guidance Handbook, another riveting piece of information. This handbook goes into a lot of detail about every single budget schedule. costs that do and don't require approval, how to handle technology purchases, a list of unallowable costs, using federal funds for conferences, how to handle food and beverage purchases, information about field trips and cell phones and travel costs. These are things that maybe don't come up all the time, and so you're not going to maybe know it, but know where this handbook is and refer to it. That's another one that I literally have in this binder that I refer to. When you call me, I promise you, I'd say 8 times out of 10, when I'm answering your question, I'm looking at my handouts here. And then what I also do when you call me is I'll take you to where I'm looking at it, because I want you to become familiar with it. And the CTE staff knows that I do this. I don't know the answers. I know where to go for them. A couple of specifics, and I think we're close to wrapping up. Program income. Let's say you have a culinary program and a cafe of some sort, and you're actually generating income. That income should be pumped back into your CTE program, and it should be used for the same purposes. So if you're generating it from your culinary program, that's where those funds should be spent. Supplies and materials versus capital outlay. If you're purchasing a group of items that function as a unit valued at $5,000 or more, that should be budgeted as capital outlay. Post-secondary tuition costs. You cannot use your Perkins funds to pay for an individual student's tuition. An individual student's, that's the key. You can use Perkins funds to pay for the whole class tuition. Okay, there's a big difference there, and I want to make sure you're aware of that. Field trips, we've covered this. Certainly allowable, can certainly be beneficial. They have to have prior approval. And then out-of-state travel. Out-of-state travel has to have prior approval, and you have to have the approval before the trip is taken. That probably shouldn't be needed to be said, but it has happened. So you have to have that prior approval before the travel takes place. Expenditure reporting. I am going just to say, in fact, I'm going to say it right here. There is a whole manual on expenditure reporting that is really, really good. I don't know if you are the folks who do your expenditure reporting. Are you? Okay, then never mind. When you want to know what you can do with your Perkins funding, or you want to, I mentioned that every grant program has a program guidelines. We get a lot of calls about what you can and can't do with funding, when your final report is due, when your grant application is due. You need to bookmark our grant opportunities page. So on TEA's website, there's a whole grant opportunities page. And there's searchable features. And what I always do is, I think it says program subject area. You can do the drop-down menu and click Career and Technical Education. And then any grants that are career and technical education will pop up. And of course, if you want to know which grants for the year 16-17, then you can do the school year as well. And that way, you're not looking at hundreds of grants that we administer, you're looking at 16-17 CTE grants. And then if you really only want this one, your Perkins, go to that. And it provides for you a little calendar of all the important dates. It also provides the program guidelines, the fiscal guidelines, any forms that you need to use. This is what I go to this all the time. When you call me and say, when is our expenditure report due? I pull this up and then I tell you. But you can do that too. So get familiar with this. It's very helpful. Here are the resources. You already know TEA's website. There's the help desk and the grant opportunities page that we just saw, the program guidelines, which you can find via grant opportunities, the administering a grant. that section of our website is very helpful. That's where you're going to find a grant management handbook, the Supplement Not Supplant handbook, the When to Amend handout that I'm talking about. And then, of course, there's also, we are all under the new EDGAR, and there's frequently asked questions about that. My contact information, I think they want us to go through grants administration. You can contact me directly. You can send me an email. You can contact me directly. I don't mind that at all. Sometimes you might be calling me and really you're asking about a programmatic question, and I'll refer you to Diane and her team. And that is it. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.